I'm Ethan Rarick. I'm the director of the Robert T. Matsui Center, which is a component of the Institute of Governmental Studies, which is the sponsor of tonight's program. This is the 35th annual IGS review of the presidency, actually. We've done this for 35 years now, so we're glad that you're here with us tonight. This is, of course, the final year of the Obama presidency, so tonight we will examine not just the presidency for the last year as we normally do, but we'll take a look at the overall legacy of the Obama presidency. And then naturally we also want to talk about the search for Obama's successor. So we'll also in the second half of tonight's program talk about the 2016 campaign, which has been so boring and predictable I don't know what we'll say, but we'll come up with something somehow. One logistical note before I introduce the panelists. You were given on your way in, or you will be given shortly, index cards for questions. If you have a question for the panelists, please write it out on the index card, hold them up at any point. There are people who will come and collect them. I'll also remind you later so that you can write those out, pass them to the end of the aisle, and hold them up. They'll be brought up to me, and towards the end of this evening's discussion, we'll read some of those questions. Please keep them brief. I always say this, but if you write a speech, I'm not going to read it. So please, brief questions for the panelists. So let me, with that, introduce our terrific panel tonight, and then we'll just jump right in and get started. To my immediate left or right as you look at the stage is Julia Azaria, who is Associate Professor and Assistant Chair in the Department of Political Science at Marquette. She holds a PhD in political science from Yale and is also a graduate of the University of Illinois. Her research and teaching interests include, most apropos for tonight, the American presidency, also American political parties, the politics of the American state, and qualitative research methods. She's a very frequent public commentator on politics. She's a regular contributor to the political science blog Mischiefs of Faction. If you don't read it, I commend it to you. She's also written for the Washington Post's Monkey Cage blog and for Politico. Next to Julia is Tom Mann, who is a senior resident scholar at IGS and a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Tom was affiliated with Brookings for many years. He held the Averill Harriman Chair at Brookings from 1991 to 2014 and was also before that Director of Governmental Studies at Brookings. He's written many books. His most recent book, with his frequent co-author Norm Ornstein, is the New York Times bestseller, It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. Mann and Ornstein were named by Foreign Policy magazine as among the 100 top global thinkers for, quote, diagnosing America's political dysfunction. Lots of material there for you. Tom was educated at the University of Florida and the University of Michigan, where he received his PhD. Next to Tom is Lanhee Chen, who is the David and Diane Steffi Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and where he is also Director of Domestic Policy Studies and a lecturer in the Public Policy Program. Lanhee was a senior advisor to Senator Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign. He was the policy director on the Romney-Ryan 2012 campaign. Proving that bipartisanship is possible, he was also appointed by President Obama to the Social Security Advisory Board. His writing appears in many outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Bloomberg View, and he frequently provides television commentary on many networks. He holds a PhD, a law degree, and a bachelor's, all from Harvard. And on the far side is Lynn Sweet, who is the Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times. She covers the White House, Congress, and politics, and appears frequently on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. She has been a fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics and has been inducted into Northwestern University's Medill Hall of Achievement and the Chicago Journalism Hall of Fame. She's also the only panelist who is a graduate of Berkeley, so congratulations.
Yay!
There you go. Harvard, Yale, Michigan, come on.
Forget it.
Yeah. I might say that apropos, as an alum, Lynn was the recipient a few years ago of the Alumni Leadership Award, which IGS gives out each year. Washingtonian magazine has named Sweet one of the Capital's 50 top journalists. So, terrific panel, and let's jump in, and we'll start off by talking about, as we said beforehand, by talking about Obama, and then maybe after a bit we'll sort of transition to 2016. So as I look at the Obama presidency, I see a presidency that was greeted by a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people with enormous hope and anticipation. and hope for a very transformative presidency. I think partly because of the kind of campaign Obama ran, partly because of the kind of election that Democrats won in 2008, dissatisfaction, right or wrong, at the time with the Republican Party and President Bush. Partially, I think it was because he was the first African-American president. So there was a lot of hope for a sort of transformative presidency. And I think now you see at least some people who think that has not come to pass and who are frustrated or disappointed by the Obama presidency, including some people on the left. And as I think about that, I wonder if that has less to do with the Obama presidency and more to do with the fact that we may overestimate the ability of any one president to transform the system, and whether we were all sort of wrong to hope for a transformative presidency. And I wonder if what you think about that. Did we all invest, and Tom, I'll ask you to start off, and then I encourage everybody to just jump in. Tom, did we all sort of as a country invest too much hope in the possibility of Obama transforming the American political system?
Yes. That's it. Pretty much takes care of it for the night. Without any question, we did. I mean, I was present at the Democratic nominating convention in Boston when Obama was the keynote speaker, and I was up in the rafters. And I heard the speech, "We are not a nation of red states and blue states. We are the United States." I mean, we, as political scientists, have been studying the development of our politics for years. And we said, this is nuts. This just doesn't make sense. He's in no position to deliver on the promise that has created the brand under which he found his way to the White House. It was absurd. But few people said anything about that because that's how most people view American politics. It's the president who does everything. And if things aren't going well, it's the president's fault. If they're going well, it's to his credit. And there you have it. And the naivete, you know, I thought was especially pronounced on the left in thinking that Obama could somehow manage to transform our politics and achieve even more than he did. And we had all this silly talk in Washington. Well, if he just schmoozed with Republicans, if, you know, crack out the bourbon and branch water in the speaker's office, and that would make a difference. I mean, all of that is foolish. The significant constraint on any transformative presidents is that we live in a constitutional system with a set of political institutions and now political parties that are ideologically distinct and intensely competitive. They're constantly using the legislative process to try to win that next majority in the House or Senate to hold on to and grab a hold of the White House. And that really keeps them from getting much of anything done. And it still goes on. People still think in those terms. It never occurs to them that under this particular environment with these kind of parties and this level of competition, that divided party government is not a route to negotiation and compromise, but is an avenue to absolute oppositional politics and gridlock. Now, in spite of that, Obama got a lot done. Most of what he got done legislatively was in his first 2 years, when actually it was about 7 months that he had 60 senators for cloture on the filibuster. But he was in a position for a while, given the crisis that confronted the country, to get some really big things done. And so I'm kind of amused near the end of his presidency, people going soft on the guy. Now, I don't know whether it's because they've been looking at the Republican presidential nomination. I've got to share this with you. Let's see, Trump or Cruz? Trump or Cruz? Woody Allen gave Republicans some great advice. Mankind is facing a crossroad. One road leads to despair and utter hopelessness, and the other to total extinction. I sincerely hope you choose the right road. So Obama's looking pretty good. I mean, David Brooks says, gee, I'm going to miss him. You know, he's, and waxes eloquent in his column. And Paul Krugman said, look back on this. The economy and everything associated with the crisis, healthcare, financial reform, and through the executive process, mainly climate change and the environment, this has been an extraordinarily successful presidency. And so, and I'll end here, if he's succeeded by a president who prevents it from being repealed or diminished or nullified, he'll probably go down as someone more consequential than most of the people who've occupied the office.
If I can jump in,
sure.
On that note, I think that this is something we hear about a lot, is that when people expected Obama to be transformative, they misunderstood how the presidency works. But I think they also misunderstood how transformation works. If we're going to have a really transformative moment, we're probably not going to know while that president is still in office. And here, I have my doubts that the Obama presidency will be transformative, but I think there are some transformative elements that might manifest down the line. And in particular, I keep coming back to the fact that this was the presidency where we saw a president come out in favor of same-sex marriage. Remembering that just in 2008, the Democratic candidate at the general election debate said, I do not support same-sex marriage. And so for Obama to have undergone that evolution, in his own words, and the kinds of conversations about equality that that's ushered in, I think that there are transformative elements there that we're not going to see that for a long time, and we never were. There was no magic words Obama was going to say that were going to magically change the political system. Transformation is slow. And it takes more than one administration.
Lynn, I want to come to Lonnie in a minute and get his take on this. But Lynn, you're in this Washington world every day. You're dealing. Was it all of us in the regular world who invested a little too much in Obama? Did insiders do the same thing? Did people in Washington expect some sort of transformative president? Did they hope for more than he could deliver, or were they more realistic?
Well, I wouldn't. First of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be back on campus. It takes a lot to become president, and there were people that thought he could win and were with him. Doesn't hurt. It's not a bad reason if you're a Democrat, pick a winner. And there are people that thought, why not give it a shot on this hope and change stuff? Now, multiple things can be true at the same time. And that's what I hope people could think about when you evaluate the candidates up today and when we start looking back. But when you talk about transformation, I think the most instructive thing is to hear from Obama himself when he said in the State of the Union address, and repeated in February 2016 in an address before the Springfield Illinois General Assembly, he was doing a Roots thing, when he said his biggest regret is that the tone of our politics hasn't gotten better since I've been inaugurated. That, to me, sums it up, that he thought it would change. He didn't explain why it did not, except that the rancor and polarization was too much for him to surpass or to chip away or to distill. So just as there are people now that want to believe that Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump could either change the system or blow it up, I do think that it is very difficult to do that as long as we have 3 units of government. And people run for president, not king or queen, but somehow that point seems to elude a lot of voters.
Do you think he personally believed that he could change the tenor of the discussion?
Yes, I believe back in 2007 and 2008, I think he thought just by being on the scene and being who he was and with his biography, he could immediately cause a change in how the nation see the United States. Now, part of this was coming out of the Iraq War, coming out of George Bush and his execution of the war. So to a degree, a Democrat taking over would have caused some change. not the sea change, but it wasn't just Americans who thought this. Remember, he got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Just
A
for
little
existing,
prematurely,
yeah.
what do we say?
Yes.
You know, to the extent, though, I think that there are people now that assess the president's term in office as less than a success, particularly for progressives. I think part of the blame does fall to the president for the kind of campaign he ran in 2008, where he talked about hope and change. He was basically an empty vessel. Okay, so what happened was when we got to the general election, a lot of people were able to ascribe to him their fondest aspirations for American politics, their wildest dreams about policy. And to be fair, I think for the first couple of years, he was, as someone has intuited, I think he was quite successful from a progressive point of view. It always confuses me when I run into Republicans who say to me, well, we don't want to elect a Republican version of Obama. And I say, no, actually we do. As conservatives, if we got half of what Obama got during his first 2 years, conservatives would be, they'd be freaking out because it would be a remarkable success. And so I think that this notion that it always confuses me when I hear, in the same way, when I hear progressives say they're disappointed with the president, it's like they have very short-term memory because they don't realize that the president got Obamacare, he got Dodd-Frank, he got the stimulus. He did migrate the discussion on immigration through executive action, whether you agree or disagree. He expanded the power of the presidency. He pulled America back from a lot of our commitments abroad. So I think in many ways the president did what progressives should be excited about. So now to see him as a disappointment, I think, is rather shallow, frankly. But to go back to the original point, I think when you run a campaign that's so vacuous, I don't know what you expect people to. I don't know what you expect the response to be. Because then people make the assumption, look, he's going to do all these things. He's going to do exactly what I think he's going to do. Well, he never said he was going to do those things necessarily. He did say he was going to stop the oceans from rising, and he gave these incredible speeches.
But he did he was, unlike, let's say, Trump, he did in the 2008 campaign have, if you wanted white papers and plans, he had them.
True, but that wasn't what his campaign was about in the general.
No, but he had the
It wasn't the
paperwork.
way people perceived his campaign.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
that's right. But you're right. He was much more substantive.
Yes.
That's certainly true than Trump.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
He'll give
I don't know what that's saying.
That's a low hurdle.
Well, there we're done.
And a lot of this is sort of as you think about, we're all talking about what he did the first 2 years. This is not an unfamiliar pattern for a presidency, right? You come into office, you have a majority in the Congress, you get a lot done early in your term. Off-year elections are usually bad for the president. In this case, they lost control of the Congress, and you did get reelected, but after that, particularly in the second term, traditionally presidents do not get a lot done, with a couple of notable exceptions. But so does this kind of meet the general contours of a typical presidential tenure? Tom?
It's worse. It's even worse than it looks. I mean, it's just terrible.
Obama's record of achievement is worse?
No, not the record. Okay. Not the record, but the difficulty of continuing on with an affirmative governing program, legislative program, given the nature of the polarization, the absolute uncompromising opposition that has now been very well reported from day one by the Republicans in the House and the Senate as a means of diminishing him, regaining control of the Congress, and keeping him to a one-term president. So he had no negotiating partners ever. It's not that he wasn't looking for them. I was with Dave Obey a couple of days ago, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and he had a lot of room to work on the stimulus. And his Republican counterpart, the ranking member from California, Jerry Lewis, was there, and Dave said, listen, we're not going to reach agreement on everything, but I'd like to know what's really important for you to have and what's important not to be there. And Lewis cut him off right then, and he says, that decision has been made already, way, way above my level. We're not playing. And the same was true with health reform and financial reform. It was a strategy of governance that that made it sort of almost impossible to govern once his, in a legislative sense. I mean, he had executive options and other kind of leadership options in foreign policy, but the legislative game was gone once 40% of the electorate rather than 60% turned out in 2010, and people still felt really badly about the economy. That's partly because they were being told to tell very badly. I mean, the objective record of what happened during that period and how just down people felt about it is really quite remarkable.
Now, you asked a little bit about comparative, and usually I think it's hard to do comparatives, but in this case you have the last Obama, Bush, and Clinton each had 3 distinct issues. You might remember that Clinton had to deal with the impeachment.
Yes.
During which it became more popular, right?
But it took a bit of time off that second term, even though, and the GOP controlled the House and the Senate then. You know, he had the Y Accords that ended up not being as substantive or as historic as you thought at the time. He appointed Madeleine Albright, first female Secretary of State. He had to deal with NATO and Yugoslavia, but the impeachment overshadowed the second term. And when it came to George Bush, he just came out of that whole first term dealing with post-9/11. He finally turns to domestic affairs, and I think one of his biggest legacy issues that now has not stood the test of time was No Child Left Behind. But I think somehow it's not, and I know I'm dealing with academics, I don't see where, I'm just trying this out, guys. I don't see where these comparisons sometimes are so useful. And this drives me a little crazy because it's all I could do sometimes just to keep up with today and last week. And someone says, well, how many executive orders did Ronald Reagan issue? You know, like, and when I get the number, yeah, because I think these things are so full of context. So Obama may have more or less, but if you don't understand the context, which you just laid out, that when you have a legislative body that says no, especially in the second term now, he's been freed. This is lifted from his shoulders. Everybody knows there's no House or Senate action. Look no further than Merrick Garland. And so he could just issue executive orders. You want to go challenge them in court? Go ahead.
But aren't we going to have, given the nature of our parties nowadays, aren't we, for both parties, aren't we going to have if the Congress is controlled by the other party than the president, the Congress is always just going to say no. I mean, we have these polarized parties that just, they're both just going to say no.
Yeah.
And that's just I think we have the wrong kind of parties for our system now.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, when Democrats controlled the Senate, and Joe Biden famously had talked about not confirming a nominee, a life appointment for a judicial nomination in the last year of a president's term, and part of that is understanding what is the proper role of the Congress in our system of government when there are opposing parties that control the presidency in Congress. And to a certain degree, Congress does have a constitutional responsibility to legislate, but it also has a responsibility to provide division of power with the executive. And so some of that is naturally built into the system. I think context is right with the Obama executive orders. I think that the question becomes, do we think it's been a lasting change? In other words, will the next president then just say, look, Obama's opened the floodgates on this. This is how I'm going to make policy as well, which I would argue is a dangerous thing to do regardless of the party. But nonetheless, is that now a precedent that we have to live with? And is that just how things get done?
No, I think one of the features of the political parties is they're not just polarized, but they're nationalized. So congressional elections are nationalized, and if the main thing that people in the districts want is to see their legislator stop Obama, then that's what the if that's the case for the next president, then that's what the situation will be. But I think that I'm seeing a little bit of hope in Congress of a kind of move towards something other than just responding to the president's agenda. From Paul Ryan, for example, a move toward thinking about governance and what that might require. So it might be that I'm sort of moderately optimistic that we're at a point of transition away from nationalization and polarization kind of being the same thing, and toward a sense where both parties have some common ground.
Yeah, the Congress is in a really interesting place because Paul Ryan is an interesting speaker. He's the first speaker to actually care about policy in a really long time.
Oh, Dennis Hastert.
I think it might be
sure
too
we should
soon.
go there, yeah.
I think it might be too soon.
Yeah. Lonnie, keep going on Paul Ryan.
Yeah, I want to
Yeah.
hear.
Well, no, look, I mean, I think he is doing his best to forge a path forward in terms of saying, look, here is an alternative to a liberal way of thinking about public policy. I think, unfortunately for Paul, what's happening is that he's getting caught in the cycle a little bit of people thinking he wants to run for president, which is, it's like everything they do. It's like, oh, he's running for president.
Right.
Oh, look, he walked from the speaker's office downstairs. He's running for president. He's not. I mean, he's not. I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to lay out a vision of conservative governance. And whether that's a good idea or bad idea politically, I think he's going to do it. Now, I think it's a good idea. There are some people who think, why bother with it? Look at what we're dealing with now in the presidential. Clearly, people don't care about policy. But I think he's doing the right thing.
Well,
from
what
the
he's
perspective of party
doing
building.
is acting as a member of the establishment, as somebody who wants to legislate as opposed to do nothing. And one of the things that I observe all the time from if you are on a condo board or Congress, you've got to get something done. Okay? If you say no all the time, then what is it you're there for? And at least Ryan wants to put stuff on the table. He strikes me, though, in the moment, conventional in a time where the politics are asymmetric.
Let's press it.
All three of you mentioned slight notes of optimism. I want to let Tom be the voice of pessimism.
Yeah, you mentioned asymmetry, and so we really need to pick up on this. I mean, there's some fundamental differences between the two political parties. One thing is, Democrats actually managed to work with Bush on a number of things for a while. It wasn't immediate opposition. They helped with tax cuts and No Child Left Behind and Medicare Part D. So there were things they were doing. But sadly, in my view, I look at all of the Republican presidential nominees, and I look at Paul Ryan, who I like as a politician, and I think he's a very effective persona. But he's easily the most conservative speaker we've had in our history, and his plan hasn't changed one bit for the last 4 years. It's all big tax cuts. I mean, it's nirvana for Grover Norquist, but it doesn't really get us anywhere. It's not realistically on the table. It can't pass muster with serious policy analysts, but he uses the language, I want to help poor people, but because of these tax cuts, I'm going to reduce food stamps and a whole host of other programs by 50 or 60% and so on. It doesn't add up, and I think until the Republican Party, and maybe a big loss this time, we're jumping ahead on that, but would begin to set up a different dynamic in which they want to govern as Republicans in the Senate did in the 70s, as Dwight Eisenhower did. But if you really think government is the source of all of our problems and you want to strangle it in the bathtub, to get as small as possible, that you think all of the programs over the last 100 years in the social policy arena are really an invasion of freedom and liberty, then you're going to have a hard time making progress. I just end with this point. One of the sources of Donald Trump's success is that he figured out in ways that his competitors for the nomination did not, that most of those white working class people with lots of resentments and who've been hurt are big, big supporters of the social safety net. And Trump said, don't you touch that Social Security or Medicare. And Ryan and others have very different ideas, not so much to save it, but to reshape it and make it a smaller part. So I think that's a big part of our politics right now.
I want to, before we go on to the next president, I want to, a couple other things on Obama I want us to touch on a little bit. One is this issue of use of executive power, particularly in the second term, really the last 6 years, I guess. Talk a little bit about, I mean, we've all said Obama got a lot done the first 2 years. Whether we like what he did or not, he got a lot done with the Democratic Congress. How much has his use of executive authority expanded? How much has he used executive authority in a way that was different than previous presidents or greater than previous presidents? Lonnie, I think you've written about this.
Yeah, I mean, what's unique about the president's use of executive authority is not necessarily the use of the executive order, because if you look at the use of the executive order, actually he is relatively similar to several other past presidents, and in fact Bill Clinton used the executive order more often than the president did. What makes the president's use of executive power unique is his use of other legally equivalent unilateral activity to define the policy environment. So for example, the president has expanded the use of the presidential memorandum, which as a matter of law is the same as an executive order. And the presidential memorandum has been used far more by Obama than by any previous president. The president's also used informal agency guidance, which was actually how he got DACA and DAPA, which are the immigration actions. Essentially, they were pieces of guidance released by the Department of Homeland Security that acted in force of law as policy. So what people have to look at when you think about the president and his use of executive authority is don't focus exclusively on executive orders. It's really kind of the different types of activity that have gone on. And in that sense, it has been an unprecedented expansion of executive authority to define policy across so many different areas. Labor policy, he's used it to, on environmental issues. He's used it, obviously, on immigration. He's used it to unilaterally defer some of the requirements of the Affordable Care Act for years at a time. So there is a pretty substantial and meaty use of executive authority there.
Well, someone's got to govern. I mean, I think that's a big part of it is the legislature hasn't been passing much legislation and addressing some of these major issues. I think that the thing that underlies, but I agree with you about some of the empirics of the situation. I think one of the things that underlies that is that it makes it really difficult for Obama to define what he's doing. And I think as we talk about the broader impact of his presidency, it's kind of, I'm making these policy changes, but because he has to make them through these means that people don't really understand and that seem kind of unilateral, it makes it difficult to explain what the broader vision is behind it. And they're also, by nature, because it's politics through enforcement, because it's governing through agencies, that it's kind of piecemeal. And that makes it really hard to explain, to link it to the terms of the campaign of hope and change and all those kinds of things.
May I respectfully disagree?
Sure.
So Dodd-Frank, the big financial overhaul bill, had multiple, dozens and dozens of things in it that needed regulatory actions. So they all might not even be done by now. And it was phased in over years, and that was a piece of legislation. I think that that Obama is defined by what he did and what he chooses. And thank you for bringing up that he is using every legal tool that he has to get government to do policies he thinks should be done. And he's doing that easier in the second term because when Congress just says no, he says what you said, someone's got to govern. So he doesn't even have to deal with Congress because they won't deal with him. So having said that, I think you do learn a lot by looking at the areas that he has been most active in, particularly in gun safety and gun violence measures, renewable energy, solar, climate change stuff, and immigration. And one reason we hear a lot about it is that Obama himself proclaimed, what was it, 2014 or 2015 was the year of action?
Yeah.
Was it 2014?
It may have been multiple years.
So in case,
Yeah.
so just
7 or 8.
in case, so a lot of things get signed by presidents all the time. Sometimes I'm looking at stuff and saying, gee, I didn't realize this happened. I mean, just a ton of stuff. If you look at regs and memos and, read if you want some steamy nighttime reading, you just take that Federal Register to bed with you, and you'll know what happened. But I think he is defining himself by some of these higher profile subjects that he's taking on. And I think he is leaving a pretty clear trail that if you want to write as a historian, that you will know where to start looking.
Do you think members of the public are giving him? I took your point to be that he wasn't getting public credit for these things. Is that?
I think that, yeah. So what I'm thinking about is, going back to the transformation question, is like if you think about, what was FDR's legacy of talking about the economic royalists, the New Deal, Reagan's revolution, government is the problem. What would be the line with Obama? And maybe it's that we just don't know, because it's really hard to know that.
Healthcare?
Yeah, but healthcare is a specific policy. It's not a governing vision. What is the role for government that he sees?
Have you seen WPA projects that endure to this day?
Of course.
Right. Why wouldn't health insurance, something people have, it's not as tangible as a public works or a park?
No, it's too tangible. It's not a vision. I'm going to inappropriately lead into the next president part. Is I think we're seeing a lot of contestation over who will be the articulator of Obama's vision and what that's going to be. It's all these different pieces. What is the overarching theme? That's what I think we haven't really seen, and what's missing as a transformative piece. And I think that's actually exacerbated by how great his policy achievements have been, that there's sort of lack of definition of what kind of broader agenda that's a part of. Vision that links back to fundamental American values.
Is that in part because of his own kind of technocratic nature?
I think maybe somewhat. But I think that the Reagan Revolution rhetoric is still alive. I think that's a big part of it.
I mean, I think it's because of the nature of the opposition he faced, and it was just a struggle. It took extraordinary action to get the Affordable Care Act. And they were ready to deal over all of it. They left the working group of the Senate Finance Committee work forever and ever, and Mitch had given instructions. You don't agree to a deal that 70% of Republican senators agreed to, and so there was never a chance. And so the strategy was to diminish, to nullify, to so remove any legitimacy from the achievements that happened, because he isn't legitimate. The opposition party isn't legitimate, and a lot of people continue with those arguments. They're not real Americans. And I think that has had a tremendous impact on how the public has perceived this, and it's sort of set the party up for Bernie Sanders, just having a couple of slogans and running with them, getting quite a response. Well, why didn't we remove private money, big money, from our politics? And why don't we have a single-payer health club? How much time do you have? I'll explain it. It's a long, long history. And why did they break up the big banks? Well, because the best judgment at the time was it may have satisfied an angry public that didn't, knew they were mad but didn't really know much about the issue. It was not the best way to go, and so they didn't do it.
The White House, though, to be fair, in 2009, set a tone in a certain way when they said there are certain things they weren't going to deal over, right? They weren't going to cut a deal on the stimulus. The Republicans wanted tax cuts. The Democrats didn't want tax cuts. And so what we had was a single party line vote on the stimulus. And then the flavor of that lingered over into Obamacare. There was this sham exercise to bring the parties together in this summit, which was just silly. Because at the end of the day, it's not like the administration was going to take input from the Republicans regarding any element of that policy. Now, if you look at the Affordable Care Act, what is most interesting to me about the Affordable Care Act is the amount of flexibility and freedom it gives the executive to administer the law. If you look at the law, one of the most common phrases you will see is the secretary shall prescribe, or the secretary shall promulgate. There's actually very little actual policy in the law. There is a lot of delegation of authority in statute to agency and what agency will do. And I would argue part of that is a desire to aggrandize the executive. But another thing is because they felt like they were going to write the law as broadly as they could, but I don't think they were really interested in getting feedback from Republicans at the time.
They ended up devoting something like 35% of the stimulus to tax cuts. Obama took that very seriously, and there were a lot of members on the Democratic side of the Hill that didn't want to do it at all. He said, no, this will get, build support for what we're doing. So they did not do that. Even though the economic research said you'll get much less of a bang for the buck.
Well, their economic research said that, to be fair.
Well, no, it was John Maynard Keynes.
Their economic research.
Lonnie is probably not a Keynesian.
I want to follow up on a point that you made about the meeting, that meaningless meeting. Politics often is about optics. And how many times did I go to events in the 2008 campaign where Obama said, we're going to have hearings on health care, they're going to be on C-SPAN. Everybody, we're going to have everything open. There was that one hearing that was seen as just theatrical in nature and not substantive and not a policy thing. Now, everyone who heard, who is familiar with process and how deal making works, even in the best sense of legislating, knows that if everything is on C-SPAN,
there's no deals being
right. I mean, so not that a lot of hearings are public, but to use this as it appealed to people. It appealed to the idealized form of how government works. And I'm all for, if it works, that would be great, right? No closed doors, I'm a reporter, I want to be in every meeting. But the obstacles seem to people who actually cover this or administer this from a policy point of view, how would you get a complex piece of legislation done if every meeting is televised? It seemed impossible. The administration didn't even try. And so what does it mean? You got stuff passed anyway, but I think it does kind of leave, when you evaluate the Obama administration, if you compare it to the campaign, just compare it to itself without comparing it to others, you could go through things that happened in the campaign, and did he act as president as much as he did as a candidate? A lot, yes. He said, and we could find it in speeches, when he said change is hard. People did, when he realized that he might have been raising hope too much, and he would say, we can't get everything done in the first term. So he would try to temper it, but I think people understood that some of the things they said weren't really the solutions to problems. I think that Obama demagogued against lobbyists. Now, a lobbyist is neither good nor bad per se. If you belong to a union, your lobbyist should be, you want your lobbyist there. The corporate lobbyist is always made into the bad guy. If you belong to a religious group and there's an issue of importance to you, why wouldn't you want your lobbyist at the table? But everybody, that was another thing when he campaigned. And to a degree, you hear this now in this, in this campaign too. And I get it.
Demagoguery in this campaign?
I get it.
Come on, Lynn.
Yeah.
I get it.
You're going too far.
Oh,
come on.
Let's turn to this campaign, actually. So let's talk about 2016 a little bit. Julia, you had a nice blog post that talked about Trump and the fact that political scientists thought they knew a lot of things that now we don't know, and maybe we can learn new things or whatever. You called Trump, quote, a real pain for political scientists. So talk a little bit about structurally, what are the things that we thought we knew about campaigns that we don't know anymore, and have we learned anything?
Yeah, so there's two things that I think most political scientists thought they knew about campaigns, and these are kind of two warring camps, but they both equally failed to predict what has happened with Trump. And one is kind of that that party elites do all the deciding before anyone actually goes to the polls in the primaries. They winnow out the candidates that are not electable, that are not viable, that don't know anything about public policy, that are hot-headed and say crazy things. All of these sorts of characteristics they're looking to weed out. And the other school of thought has kind of puts voters in the driver's seat a little bit more, but similarly, this idea that that these things kind of work themselves out, that the early voters will send a signal about who's electable and who's viable, and that will similarly kind of winnow out all of the people that don't have the kinds of qualities that we would associate with a successful general election candidate. Clearly, those fields were both kind of wrong. The first one in particular. So we're kind of left with a sense of, for political scientists, we're kind of left with a sense of what is the missing link that allows us to understand what goes on in the primaries, or who is really in control of this process. And I actually find this kind of puzzling because it seems to me that also, to speak for a moment about the Republican side, that Republican elites, after Trump did so well on Super Tuesday, were similarly puzzled by this. And my thought was, this is your formal process. This is the way the process works. These are your voters. They went to the polls, and this is who they voted for. What's the crisis? So I think there is this kind of question about why did this happen? Is it because there were too many Republicans in the field? Is it because people didn't coordinate to stop Trump quickly enough? What is this a very calculated? I think actually the most interesting question I've heard about this election is this a calculated media strategy by Trump, or is he just saying things and this is all just kind of happening? Which I personally find that second universe to be an extremely disturbing one to live in. The first one is also moderately disturbing, the idea of such a carefully calculated media strategy. But the second one, that someone's just coming in and throwing stuff at the wall, and then and it's become, this is really terrifying. So that's sort of a nutshell, a very nutty nutshell of what my political science perspective.
Lanhee, you worked for Marco Rubio in this campaign. So Julia talked about Trump and the party's response to Trump. What does Trump say about your party? What does this year say about your
No pressure.
party?
I think there's a lot of different elements that are going on. One is there is a deep frustration in the Republican electorate with what they perceive as being goals not achieved by people they've elected in the past, right? So there is this deep disquiet with the establishment, whoever that is, and the notion that they have betrayed conservative principles. And it's difficult for me to assess really kind of what the charge is, because the proof points are not particularly persuasive to me. For example, they'll say, well, you didn't repeal Obamacare yet. And it's like, it's hard to repeal Obamacare when Obama is the president. Turns out. So there are just these things, and I can understand some measure of frustration, but the levels of frustration I think are really extreme in some cases. The second issue is, Trump is masterful at his manipulation of media. I don't mean that derisively toward the media. I just mean that he knows what he's doing. The guy's been on TV for like 2-3 decades, right? He understands exactly what makes news. He understands exactly how to drive news. Some of that has been because he's managed to get a lot of coverage. But he's also driven a lot of coverage because, the thing about saying crazy things is it does drive coverage. If you say something crazy and you're a legitimate presidential candidate, it would be malpractice for the media not to report it. And so in that sense, he understands this cycle better, I think, than any candidate we've seen, Republican or Democrat, in a really long time. And then the third thing is, there was a excess of candidates that were appealing to whatever lane you want to call it, whether you want to call it the establishment, center-right, elite, whatever lane it is. You had a number of sort of people that had legitimate records who would have been, I think, very strong nominees for the Republican Party. And there was some cannibalization, I think, that went on there as the process went on. So that's kind of what I think is going on. I mean, that's very analytical. Obviously, it is somewhat frustrating to see because, if you look, for example, at Trump's interview that he gave to the New York Times on foreign policy, which was 2 weeks ago. I mean, it was a tour de force of incoherence. But that doesn't seem to stop anybody from, because the answer, the refrain that I get, that people come back to, and there are some very intelligent and reasonable people I know who are supporting Donald Trump, and they'll say, well, really at the end of the day, none of that necessarily matters because he can always get that information later. What matters is his ambiance, if you will, right? This sort of ambiance of somebody who will cut really good deals and who will do something that no politician has done before, and they're just sick of ordinary politicians, so they want something totally different. So why not send this guy up there who describes debates as elegant? I don't even know what it means to have an elegant debate. But, I mean, I think that's persuasive to a lot of people.
But why has it, so there is this, you mentioned the frustration that, a sense that among certain conservative voters that elected politicians have abandoned conservative principles. But then, in many cases, they turn to Trump, who is not really
Correct. He's not a conservative.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
I mean,
So
he's a nationalist.
They would turn to Ted Cruz or something.
Right. Well, but see, there are things that voters will identify that they believe to be conservative, and they will use those as heuristics to sort of justify their support for Trump. So they'll say, for example, he's tough on immigration, and they see that as being a conservative position. Or they'll say he's going to be tough on our trading partners like China, and that's perceived as being conservative. So it's not conservative in the classical sense, or I guess in the sense of understanding what conservatism has come to mean in the United States. But it is sort of like it's not irrational. I mean, people have a rational explanation for why they believe him to be conservative.
Can I say something about Trump? One of the things, and Lonnie, I'm sure you'll tell me if I'm not understanding this correctly, but one of the things that's really struck me about him as we talk about the Republicans as a party that's kind of abandoned governance is that Trump talks about governance. He doesn't talk about it in, with detail. I don't think he goes to bed with the Federal Register, but but he talks about cleaning, having clean streets, not having people on the streets. He talks about foreign policy and certain ends he would like to accomplish. He talks about healthcare. He doesn't talk about principles in the same way that Cruz does, but I think he is in a weird way talking about getting things done, even if it's in a very weird way.
Yeah, well, that's right. And so if you ask like Trump voters, if you charge Trump with being sort of light on policy, they'll say, no, I don't think he's light on policy at all. He's told us he's going to build a wall that Mexico's going to pay for. His name's going to be on the wall. He's told us that we're gonna put tariffs on China. I mean, they'll name for you because, and part of it is because, again, it gets back to the effectiveness of the campaign he's run, which is that he takes like 6 or 7 ideas and he repeats them, and the repetition is so effective because as Lynn knows from covering this, you do have to repeat something a lot for it to register. And he's now at the point where I think it's registered, and he's done it
for
effectively
Bernie Sanders too.
Yeah, absolutely, same thing.
And that is, it is remarkable for everybody who like sweats over a term paper or something, and then you think, gee, I spent 30 hours on it, and then Bernie Sanders has 5 points and 5 paragraphs, and Donald Trump has nothing, and I work. This is like the Hillary thing. She works so hard, and she has all these position papers, and thought things through. And then these guys are coming, and they just have like 7 things that they keep repeating. It's not fair.
Yeah, but you know what? From a campaign perspective, one can argue they haven't run a good campaign because we don't know what she's for.
Well, I think you do know what she's for. It's a lot. It's a lot.
They need to focus on a few.
Well,
probably.
but it's interesting. You want to get to that balance, right, where it's more than a slogan, but it's not 4,000 points of information here, and it makes it. What you have here, I think, we're talking a lot about Trump. I think we should bring in the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, which is very similar on it. I mean, we're in a public university here, okay? You charge tuition. You tell me how hard will it be to make the University of California system free for everybody? Okay, how hard, what year do you think it would happen with President Sanders? Year 1, year 2? No one, does anyone believe that you can make this school tuition free?
Well, Yep.
Okay.
In
In this country, in this climate,
Many countries have single-payer health care.
Okay.
So Tom, I want to.
Okay.
I want to go to Tom and let you weigh in. We've talked a lot about Trump. We've talked about Sanders and Clinton. Before you do that, though, let me suggest that if people have questions, write them down, hold them up, pass them to the end of the aisle, and they will be collected. And there are people down here who say they need cards, so somebody can bring down cards to the second row down here.
I guess I'm provocative.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
I want to be like Bernie Sanders, that is a grumpy old white guy, and tell you how, while my colleagues have been, I think, absolutely accurate in talking about the Trump phenomenon, they don't tell us just how disturbing this is to our democracy and why we should all care about this. I mean, many thoughts go through my mind, but one of them is every other democracy in this world doesn't have primary elections to nominate candidates. They delegate that to the political parties because, and the framers would be appalled with the idea of primary selection of nominees. They worried about the excesses of small d democracy. Many, many years ago, when I was involved in some of the reform efforts, I was a champion of superdelegates in the Democratic Party. It was to get politicians and party officials back to the conventions. It seemed to me we needed that so much. We need peer review. We need assessments of the personal qualities of individuals and how they would govern. I mean, these are all important things. Instead, we set up this really destructive dynamic where elected officials make these ridiculous promises throughout the year in Congress. We will repeal Obamacare, and we will do this and that, when they know in their own minds that it's impossible to do, and it's going to come back and haunt them. I mean, in some ways, this is partly the fruits of Republican strategy of absolute opposition and demonization of government. But it's worrisome. It's very worrisome. Trump, however amusing he is also a pretty authoritarian guy and doesn't have many strong feelings about the niceties of democracy. Monkey Cage has had some reports lately on sort of values in the Americas, and it turns out we're not looking so strong on the democracy side, the acceptance of the legitimacy of the system and of others, and we're really fostering something that's really scary in my view. I've never, in all of my decades of watching American politics and trying to make sense of it, I've never been more disturbed by a presidential nominating contest as I have with this one.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that if I can. I think one of the things that these two candidacies in parallel, Trump and Sanders, kind of illustrate is that there are some differences between democracy that is inviting everybody to vote and kind of expanding participation, and democracy that is, like you said, these values of tolerance, democracy that is values of respecting the rights of minority groups that in a process where everybody votes, they probably would lose. Like, what is the line about democracy has to be something more than two wolves and a chicken deciding what to have for dinner? I think but what is then frustrating about the Sanders candidacy is that he does articulate a model of democracy that very much is about if we just let everybody participate more and just got rid of all these other voices and repealed Citizens United, all the people would sing together in a wonderful progressive chorus. And clearly what we're actually seeing is that a lot of people in the electorate have some work to do on their substantive democracy views. And I think those two things are really at odds. I think we're seeing that all over politics in 2016, and no one is putting these two things together.
Is
I guess both senators, but in particular, I'm thinking of Trump here. Is Trump fundamentally different than other populists of the past? I mean, I think of Ross Perot. I think of going back to George Wallace. I think that we've had these kinds of candidacies before, haven't we? This is not totally new, although they haven't been the major party nominee.
Yeah, that's
Right.
what's
That's the key difference. We've had populist movements on the left and right throughout our history, but they tend to be marginalized, and they certainly don't engage in a hostile takeover of one of our major political parties. That really is the difference. It's whatever the control mechanisms are that keep us from really heading off somewhere dangerous. I mean, that go against the sort of values of welcoming people to our country and to constantly strive to deal with the history of race in America. There's so many things there that are just being cavalierly violated and championed, and the Republican Party candidates facing this thought he was nuts, but they were afraid to sort of challenge him in the beginning because they saw he was getting a fair amount of support, and they wanted to get some of that support too. Sometimes this is what happens. Things take off, and the kind of safety valves and mechanisms in the system aren't working because the players that are there to do that see other incentives and elements in the political context.
Well, I agree with the what you're saying about safety valves, but let's not get carried away with the beauty of the past. I think you two would be alone here on this stage, I think, several decades ago. So, let's not.
Lots of awful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of the reason that the institutions were able to work that way is because there was no conversation about racial diversity or gender diversity.
So it's interesting because traditionally, primary elections are fought over relatively narrow turf. Ideology, in terms of ideology and policy, traditionally, that's the reason why primary campaigns get so nasty. Actually, is because they are fighting. I think. For example, if you think about 2012, the Republican candidates were probably in agreement on 97% of issues. So the 3% that you disagree on become hugely important. They're the subject of television advertising. Campaign operatives spin media into thinking this is like the most important distinction we've ever seen. And this year is actually somewhat different in the sense that there is a gulf between Trump and the rest of the Republicans on a lot of issues, just as there's a gulf between Sanders and Clinton on a lot of issues. For the Republicans, you have a guy who takes an anti-free trade view in the Republican Party, and certainly the nominee of the Republican Party has traditionally been for open markets. If you look across health care, as an example, Trump has called for prescription drug reimportation and direct negotiation of drug pricing by Medicare, which are anathema to conservatives traditionally, and that's a difference. And I mean, these are major policy differences, and the gulf is actually quite wide. So this is a unique primary. And I think part of the reason why Republican candidates had a tough time initially dealing with Trump is because they didn't know how to respond because the differences were so wide. It's like, well, what do you do with this? I mean, it's so different from anything that we've encountered before. As on the campaign side, whether it's participating in a campaign or studying a campaign or preparing for a debate, it's hard. It's not like anything that candidates have had to do.
Can I put you on the spot for a moment, Lonnie? So if Trump is the nominee, do you expect there's been talk of a third-party conservative candidate to run against him? Do you think that would happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty highly likely that there will be some effort. I don't know whether it will really get legs because I think the realization, obviously, is that it would be akin to electing. I mean, it would elect Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, I suppose. And so there's some concern about that, but I just think that there's enough angst about Trump, and there's enough discussion, and there's enough sort of efforts underway that are in the very early stages to build out some kind of platform. Obviously you've got ballot access issues, and there are sore loser laws that would prevent, in many states, people that had run for the nomination from being the standard bearer of a third party. But there's been discussion about David Petraeus or Jim Mattis. I mean, there's been lots of names thrown out there. Will it actually happen? You know, it's possible, but I don't know. I would say it's highly possible that there's an effort, but I don't know how much support it actually gets.
Lynn, you said yes at one point. What in Washington do people really think this is a practical thing, that there would be a third party?
I think the focus on is finding a alternative at a convention, not a third party. The obstacles of getting on ballots in 50 states are very high, very costly, and some deadlines have passed to get on. You know, so when Trump and Sanders complain about the system being rigged, the system is rigged against everybody who wants to run for office. If you even look at the simple, you can't just sign up and say, I want to run in most places. You have to get nominating petitions. You have to, you know, it's like the driver's license, the main business license, you know, it's a permit to build. The system is created to make it harder, not easier, to run, and it gets progressively harder the higher you want to go. And in this case, late in the game, starting with a third-party movement is very high. If the idea is among Republicans is to get rid of Trump, wouldn't it be much better just to get an act together for the convention if he goes into it without the delegates?
Yeah, I mean, there is this one issue that people should keep an eye on with respect to the convention. It's something called Rule 40B in the rules of the Republican Party. And lest you think it's abstruse and irrelevant, it actually is highly relevant, because what Rule 40B says, which was put in 2012, by the way, by the Romney campaign to prevent Ron Paul from being nominated on the floor of the convention, what Rule 40B says is that for a candidate to be placed in nomination for the presidency or vice presidency of the United States, that candidate needs to have won a majority of delegates in 8 states.
Yeah.
So that only would apply currently to Donald Trump. Ted Cruz believes he will meet that threshold before we reach Cleveland.
But isn't that one of the rules, if the Rules Committee could change?
So right. That is a temporary rule of the party in the sense that every convention writes its own rules. So they could get rid of 40B, just like they could get rid of the requirement that that you need 1,237 delegates to be the nominee. That is also a temporary rule of the party. So they could say, no, actually, just kidding, it wasn't 1,237, it was 1,000. Now, I think that's a much more unlikely scenario, because there's a lot of precedent. I mean, there's not been a convention where it hasn't been a majority of the delegates. But 40B is so recent that there's been a ton of discussion about what will happen around that rule.
Rule 40B has been interpreted by some Republican Party operatives as saying at the time at which a candidate gets a majority of delegates in 8 states, it doesn't have to be in the primaries and caucuses. It could be at the convention on a later ballot. And that's how Paul Ryan or someone else manages to come in.
Yeah, does 40B go away if they go to a second ballot?
No, I mean 40B adheres. I mean 40B adheres once the. I mean 40B adheres to any of the proceedings of the convention. Okay. I've heard this alternate interpretation. I don't find it particularly legally persuasive, but I think that the cleaner way for the Rules Committee, the cleaner way would be for the Rules Committee to address it when the Rules Committee meets the week before the convention. The challenge now is that there's an optical issue too, which is that 40B prevents John Kasich from being nominated in his home state, which would be a little weird. For the sitting Republican governor of the state where the convention is being held to not be put in nomination of a state he won.
So doesn't that speak to getting rid of that rule?
Kasich thinks so. I don't know about Trump and Cruz.
Before we go to audience questions, I want to ask just sort of briefly of the whole panel. We've talked a lot about, just in the last few minutes, the Republican nomination, what will happen, who knows. Does everybody agree that basically the Democratic nomination fight is over, that Clinton will be the nominee? No, you say no. You think Sanders could still be the nominee?
I'm not willing to make a public pronouncement that it's over, though the math is in Hillary Clinton's favor. I don't think I need to bake the cake yet. So
you could probably bake it on April.
There. I don't want him to yell at me again. So.
Bake it on April 18th. That is, it seems to me the only possibility is a collapse of Hillary, where she's been dominant, and Bernie, takes advantage of it. So if she loses New York and Pennsylvania by a big enough margin, it would alter the dynamics of the race in a pretty profound way. Right. Hillary knows that. And I'm guessing she'll win by at least 10 15 percentage points. And then, yeah, it's just a matter of time. But Bernie, who got into this almost on a lark, is suddenly seeing his ability to raise $45 million a month in small contributions. And this is, this is big time. He's always been an ambitious man, but he didn't expect to be playing in this level of politics. And right now, he's still got a little foothold to stick it out. But if she wins those states, and you look at the rest of the ones, she'll have the remaining. She will have the delegates without the superdelegates, and with them, it'll be overwhelming. Hillary dropped out in the end, although she stayed in through California, and I suspect that'll happen with Bernie as well.
And we should note that she has, in earned delegates, she has a larger lead over Sanders than Barack Obama ever had over her.
Exactly.
As she points out.
And she's got, what, 2 or 3 million more votes. It's not as if the public has been denied the representation for Bernie Sanders. Au contraire.
So let's go to a few questions from the audience, and one is a perfect follow-on to this. It is the Bernie Sanders campaign a flash in the pan or a harbinger of more to come? And I think I will interpret that to mean not with relation to Sanders, because I think he'd be 77 next time around, but rather does his campaign augur some kind of new Democratic Party?
I want to just address, if I may, one small part of it on how he's raising money. And that is, it is for him only. When Barack Obama in 2007 and 2008 was able to have a combination of big money and traditional finance fundraisers, bundlers, et cetera, in his day, it was a big deal that he also had, use social media to network to get small donors in big numbers. This doesn't happen all the time. You can't say there's a change if it doesn't happen. There's no Senate race that has happened since. So give Bernie Sanders a lot of credit, but it's for him. Okay? It's not, if it was going to happen, if this was a replicable thing in politics, then we would have seen it more after Obama. One person, Bernie Sanders, has been able to take what Obama started. We also have more sophisticated and more platforms to make it easier to put in your $27. But anyone could do it if the public had a will. So in that one small thing, I don't think we have permanently changed the way we finance political campaigns for everybody, though certainly it changed things for this one time in this one place. The rest, I'll leave up to you.
Can we go back to sort of Sanders as a, does he something, is there something ideologically different going forward about the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I mean, and I really strongly agree with that that's a really important component of party building, is raising money on behalf of other party members. But in terms of the ideology, I have been thinking, and this will probably, I'm hoping maybe this will make everybody mad on every side of the aisle, but I think that Sanders is playing a very similar role to what Reagan did in 1976 against Gerald Ford. As a kind of harbinger of the ideological direction of the party and of a renewal of these broader visions. And I think that it would be, from a party building perspective, again, I really strongly agree with Lynn about the organizational component. So I think that from the party's perspective, it would be really good if the person who picked that up in whatever the next electoral cycle might be is someone who has a little bit more regard for the Democratic Party. And if that doesn't happen, then I think we'll be in another kind of unprecedented situation, and maybe some deeper organizational renewal. But yeah, that's kind of the role I see him playing.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of the long-term impact. If on the major issues, the party's sort of in agreement. The problem is getting them done in terms of campaign finance reform. Certainly moving really toward universal health. I mean, the single payer we've got 40, 50 years of history working against that. So you'll make at least half of the members of the American public angry if you try to do it, and it's just not going to happen. So I think this will fall off, and what will win is, going back to your transformation, it's the series of incremental changes that add up to something consequential over time. If you look at the Democratic caucus in the House and the Senate, you don't see this movement developing at all. And there's always been a sort of left out there ready to, for a while it was around the war in Iraq, and that was easy to bring together other party members. But tough on trade deals, Democrats have been there for a long time. I keep looking for real changes in direction. It's all ephemeral. It's symbolic. It's not about different governing agendas. And to the extent it's about how to get there, I don't think there's much. You're going to have a hard time reading any start to a political revolution coming out of this nomination battle.
A couple of other questions on Sanders. A couple of people ask about, in a Clinton-Trump election, where do the Sanders people go? Do they largely stay home? Do they vote for Clinton? Somebody asks even, do they vote for Trump because they want a non-establishment candidate? What happens to these Sanders folks in the general?
The data suggests that they're really Democrats or independent leading Democrats. The people who are flirting with Trump are almost entirely segregated from the people flirting with Bernie Sanders. And so my guess is, at least on the Democratic side, you would get very little party defection.
Yeah, I give Hillary Clinton a higher likelihood of being able to coalesce her party than I would of Donald Trump being able to coalesce the Republican Party.
And speaking about Trump, one other question is, how does the Tea Party movement play into the 2016 presidential elections, in particular connection between Tea Party supporters and Trump supporters? I think actually in a lot of ways the Tea Party folks have been more Cruz supporters.
Yeah, I think the answer is it's complicated. I do think, first of all, if you look at the voters that Trump is winning, by and large they self-identify as somewhat conservative or even moderate for the most part. Okay, so I think a lot of sort of traditional Tea Party folks would not self-identify in that way. But there is, without a doubt, a certain element of people that may have previously identified with the Tea Party who now identify with Trump more than the Tea Party, thereby trumping any previous affiliation they may have had with the Tea Party. So I think it's a little complicated, but by and large, I think the pool that Trump is fishing out of are actually mostly voters that are only somewhat conservative, because Trump is doing very well with conservative and very conservative voters, and that hasn't changed in any election. Now, Cruz did do well with more liberal Republican voters in Wisconsin, although there is reason to believe Wisconsin may be an anomaly. That is a piece of data that we'll have to figure out what's going on.
Wisconsin.
Yeah, Julie, it's your fault.
Yeah. I didn't vote for Trump in the Wisconsin primary, I promise. So, yeah, I've looked at the data on this, and if you look at Tea Party supporters compared to other Republicans, this is not going to surprise anybody. They're pro-smaller government. They're more anti-programs like Obamacare, but they also are more conservative. Conservative is not the right word. They are more hostile on racial issues, more hostile to immigration, more hostile toward programs that they perceive as helping blacks. They share those latter characteristics with Trump supporters, but Trump supporters, relative to Cruz and Kasich supporters, are actually less anti-Obamacare and less concerned about the size of government. So I don't know how this plays out in terms of how that overlap looks, but it's a kind of odd relationship. So that's just a little bit more data to back up the same point there.
And another question is, thinking about, we talked about Sanders and what he portends for the future. Thinking about future elections, how do you think Trump's success will impact the process, candidate styles, other aspects of elections going forward? Is Trump an anomaly, or does he have any long-term linear?
Anomaly.
A second vote for anomaly.
Okay.
I mean, who else has had a reality TV show?
I wouldn't know what Lonnie is.
No, I mean, I think I can understand, like, Trump in his present incarnation, as we know him, I think is an anomaly. But I think that there are elements of what he's saying from a policy perspective. That, you know, there has been this division in the conservative movement, especially in economic policy, between traditional supply-siders and the so-called reformicons,
Right.
who have called for greater attention to middle-income wage stagnation in particular has been a big issue that they've asked people to pay attention to, as well as family formation. But I think what Trump does kind of portend is maybe a greater focus going forward in certain areas and certain kinds of policies that speak maybe more directly to this band of voters. Whether it means that the Republican Party changes its conventional view on policy areas, I think it's too early to tell. But I do think that there is some lasting influence in terms of forcing us to evaluate the conventional wisdom on free trade, for example, which, by the way, is not a 2016 phenomenon. We've seen this going back a few years. Yeah. In 2012 even, we had this was a huge issue in the Midwest as well.
But if you, I'm not disagreeing with you, but could you explain to me then how you square saying that some of this resonates with an appeal to middle-class voters, and everything will be changed if we just fix our trade policy?
Well, I think that there is I think some middle-class voters, particularly in the Midwest, believe that trade is responsible for the fact that they don't have the same job they used to have. And so what they would like to see is a Republican Party that's more directly responsive on that issue metric in particular. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen, because I still think we need a party that's in favor of open markets, and I think the Republican Party will still be the home of a pro-open markets policy. But at the end of the day, there is this angst about trade, and a lot's been written on trade, and I'm not necessarily convinced that, you know, all of it is. I think we're overanalyzing the issue a little bit. I think there is a certain amount of just hostility to things that are perceived as being un-American that fits into the rubric of trade. But trade's an example of that.
Right.
Let's go back to Obama for a couple of final questions here. And there are a couple that deal with race, which, as I was doing some reading for this, we didn't talk about this earlier, but I was struck actually by how little of the analysis that I was reading about Obama's presidency addressed his historic place as the first African-American president. It was kind of striking to me. So there's a couple of questions here. To what degree has Obama's race been a factor in Republican conservative obstructionism? Would he have been more productive with the same proposals if he were white? And why and how can we assess Obama's success as a president without acknowledging racism as part of the opposition? Let's broadly talk about Obama's historic role and how much of the opposition and division in the country was due to race.
The research suggests that this is a factor, and that Obama's presidency has led people to kind of their views on race then influence their views on Obama's policies. This is sort of complicated experimental research, but it suggests that racial attitudes essentially predict people's viewpoints on some of these policy positions. And I think one of the things that's come out of our discussion is we've talked a lot about dysfunction in Washington, and we've talked a lot about elites. And the electorate has been kind of a supporting player. And here I think it's really important to talk about the electorate, because I think there are people in the electorate who are uncomfortable with a non-white president. And those are the people that are voting for some of these folks in Washington. And so they're responding to what's happening.
Go ahead.
I think the nature of the Republican opposition in Congress and among their activist groups was not strongly motivated by his race, because Bill Clinton ran into the same experience. Not a single Republican voted for his deficit reduction package. The parties were evolving because Republicans had turned on George W. Bush, and Newt led the battle against them. A lot of things were going on, but the parties really have become so distinctive and oppositional now. I think the race element is to be found in the electorate more so than among members of Congress.
And if I may follow on that, to kind of add that yes, race is a factor in terms of unfinished issues that Obama's trying to address in his final months in office. But going back to Trump, usually one would have thought, if this wasn't the election cycle that it was, that anyone who was a birther would just by definition not be a major front-running presidential candidate.
Lanhee, the question one of them dealt specifically with Republican opposition to Obama. So let me ask you about the Republican Party. Is there, among Republican voters, is there some element of race in the opposition to President Obama?
You know, I think it is. I think that there are so many factors. I think race, probably is one of those factors. I think that, I don't know, at the end of the day, I think we've gotten into this very polarized political environment now where nobody can say anything nice about anybody else because then it's like fodder for a TV ad. But, I think that as Republicans, speaking as a Republican, I think we would do well to acknowledge the fact that somewhere in America there's a kid who looks at the president as he is his president, he's our president, and that kid believes that he can someday be president. And that is a remarkable accomplishment. And I do not think we can underestimate that fact. But even that's controversial to some who I know, and that's unfortunate. And what drives that animosity? A lot of different things. But rather than trying to figure out, like, are Americans really racist? Are they really genderist? There are some Americans that are probably all those things, right? But what we know is that the last 8 years have been very divisive, and one can only hope the next 8 won't be. But given where things are headed, it is tough to see things being a whole lot different.
And that leads into the final. We're going to do 2 final questions here, which are both sort of about the future both of the presidency and the political system generally. The first is, given your description of Obama's use of presidential power to deal with congressional opposition, why would we not expect this style to be the norm going forward for future presidents? Is that if there is divided government, is the norm aggressive use of executive power because the 2 parties are too polarized to actually work together?
I think if we get the kind of divided party government that we've had during Obama, that is a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, and the perception is there's no appetite for negotiating, bargaining, compromise, then yes. And Democrats also have a tremendous demographic advantage in presidential elections, but likewise, Republicans have a tremendous foothold in the House, and the guarantee of their continued dominance of the Congress is having a Democrat in the White House. It does wonders. Also does wonders for electing Republican governors and Republican state legislatures. So, I mean, the most pessimistic assessment is that we fall into this, that Republicans don't take the advice of their party after the 2012 election and try to broaden their appeal and find it more and more difficult, absent an economic crisis under a Democrat, to get it done, to become competitive, that we're going to have this kind of divided party government. May avoid it with a strong Democratic presidential victory, but then you lose it in the first midterms. It's partly the structure of our system. It's the nature of the parties. It's the fact that one party is a governing party and kind of likes government and is always willing to do a deal if it's preserving government, and it's a mixed economy, private markets and government regulation. But if the Republican Party stays more where they are now, then I think our dysfunctional politics will continue.
And before, I think you want to say something about that, but I'm going to just throw in the last question here, and then we can talk about it. It gives you all a chance to be optimistic if you wish, or pessimistic. Do you see any avenue to get some kind of functional government operating again where compromise is not a dirty word? So is some lessening of the polarization of the 2 parties possible, some return to parties that can compromise?
I don't think it's going to come from the institutions. I think it's going to come from shifting terms of debate. And I think what the 2 parties need, both the citizens and elites, is some broad goals that they agree on, and then disagreement about how to achieve those goals. And I saw some weird glimmers of hope with that in one of the Republican debates, actually, where the Republican candidates were all arguing about how to deal with economic inequality. And I thought, okay, if we can all agree that that's an issue and we need to do something about it, then we might actually be able to move forward in a halting and probably somewhat hostile way. But that would be real improvement. So I'm seeing a few kernels of that.
One of the things that President Obama had talked about, again, in his State of the Union, and you hear this, his solution to this permanent gridlock, very long term, is to change how we elect members of Congress and get rid of gerrymandering. I think that is something that in the abstract is a great idea. I think it would be very tough to execute in reality. You know, I kind of like live every day in the real world of politics. So I would think it would just be hard. But having said that, California changed its primary system. Who would have thought? So things can happen, but not all at the same time. But maybe gerrymandering is one way long term to force a change, because sometimes it's easier just to change the people than to change the partisanship and polarization. And that if you change the mechanics of the system, that would change that.
You know, I think we have entered an era of policymaking by crisis, and I think if you look at the major policy achievements of the last several years, a lot of them have been driven by crisis in one way or another. The economic crisis led to the stimulus and the Dodd-Frank Act, and to a certain degree to Obamacare. Yeah. If you think about the debt ceiling crisis of 2010, that got us to the Budget Control Act and to subsequent budget agreements. And so we do have this status quo now, where we make policy based on the crisis of the moment. And whether at some point people get fed up and say, we need regular order again, I don't know. But policy does get made. It just gets made in a pinch, and oftentimes at the last minute and last hour. It's not ideal for good policy, but it's the system we have.
I'm trying really hard to be optimistic because that's my basic nature. Where is government? It's true. Where is government working? It's working in a lot of big urban areas, metropolitan areas, where you really see extraordinary steps being taken in terms of public-private collaborations, universities, sort of businesses, community development organizations. Now, mind you, most of those areas, cities, that's where Democrats cluster, with or without gerrymandering. The exception is Chicago. Set aside, assume no Chicago. But really, if you look across the country, and we have a metro policy studies program at Brookings, and it's really quite stunning to see the successes in the globalization occurring in a constructive way, and job development, and cities being remade, and some of the old Rust Belt areas being remade with human knowledge and intelligence, production of said soft power developing. So that's a start. We begin there, and I mean, over time, it's going to take someone on the Republican side saying Grover Norquist doesn't control our party. It's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. We've had enough experience with supply-side economics, and let's get real. And we need a government. We know markets work best when there's proper and needed regulation. Not any regulation, but intelligently done. So I'm looking for some of it to come from the business community, who are getting a little scared of what they see happening in the Republican Party. They've been wimps lately. They used to be public intellectuals and leaders and helping. So that's another area. My belief is that until we deal with the problem of the radicalization of the Republican Party, any number of changes, diminishing gerrymandering or new kind of primaries aren't going to make any difference. Our system is set up so that we need two governing parties so they can do deals when when majorities or supermajorities are, and I don't mean Donald Trump type deals either, but genuine negotiation, compromise, so we got to bring the Republican Party. They have to bring themselves, be encouraged for sort of new leaders. I keep looking to some people in the Senate who played such an extraordinary role. There's a book called The Last Great Senate by Ira Shapiro, looking at the period of the 70s and early 80s, and it was many of the dominant players were Republican senators. It was just an extraordinary period, and there's no reason that we can't get back to this. This development has occurred over decades. We now have 5 books that chart the history of the Republican Party and how they moved from Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln and Dwight Eisenhower to something very different, and it could change.
All right, it's a little bit of a partisan note to end on, but we'll interpret it as optimistic. So, and we won't ask Lonnie to defend the Republican Party right now. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists. Please join me in thanking them.